Now, in the bonus portion of last night's program, I mentioned in that bonus portion that goes to our subscribers that I wanted to talk about this relatively new, to me anyway, fascist organization in this country that is starting to gain adherents. And these are members of law enforcement, so this is particularly worrisome to me. The name of this organization is the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And it was put together by a guy named Richard Mack, who is the former sheriff in Arizona. It was founded by him in 2011. And it goes by the initials CSPOA. Come on, Mike. Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And what it basically says is that elected sheriffs should be the supreme law in this country. And the group says, quote, "It must protect our citizens from the overreach of an out-of-control federal government by refusing to enforce any law we deem unconstitutional or unjust," end quote. Well, any law that the members of this sheriff's organization deems to be unconstitutional, not what the Constitution says, not what the Supreme Court has said. And as far as unjust, prohibiting women from controlling their own bodies would possibly be considered to be unjust, wouldn't it? But that's not what these fascist son of a bitches are talking about. And according to the guy who put this organization together, this Richard Mack, former sheriff, he said, quote, "The safest way to actually achieve all of this is to have local law enforcement understand that they have no obligation to enforce the laws they don't agree with. They're not laws at all anyway. If they're unjust laws, they are laws of tyranny." Unjust laws, a decision that's going to be made by a sheriff somewhere. You know, the stereotypical sheriff in the South and a lot of the Southwest is a beer-bellied, khaki pants-wearing lunatic who chews Red Man tobacco and doesn't like anybody that ain't Christian and white. Now, there's a report put together about this. It was produced by the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism in collaboration with the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting. The Howard Center is based at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And it is an initiative, this investigative unit, an initiative of Scripps Howard Fund, a journalist, Scripps Howard, you're familiar with him, in honor of the late news industry executive and pioneer Roy Howard. So, in other words, it is an investigative unit that looks at the insanity of certain laws, the attempt to move the country toward fascism using media and law enforcement, and this is one of the examples. Now, this so-called sheriff's group, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, to be specific, some of the laws that they have said they're not going to enforce, first of all, are the gun laws. To these crazy bastards, everybody should be carrying a weapon. Everybody should be fully armed. And if somebody fucks with you, I guess you're just supposed to shoot them dead. So they want no gun control. They totally are against the COVID-19 mask mandates. Obviously, they're Christian because they want people to get sick and die and go up to heaven, right? They're against public health restrictions of any kind, like vaccinations before children go to school. And they're also against any reported election fraud. They don't believe election fraud should be reported. They believe that the sheriff's department should count or should designate the people to count the votes, and once that person counts the votes, that's it. If you feel there was fraud, blow it out your ass, pal, because the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association does not want to hear from you. This organization has quietly spread its ideology across the country, and they're trying to become more mainstream, in part by securing state approval for tax-funded law enforcement training. That's according to the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. That's what they discovered. And one of those training centers, I have a suspicion, is the training center here in the Atlanta area that has generated so much controversy of late, where there have been demonstrations. One counter-demonstrator, one person demonstrating against this police facility, was shot dead by police who said he was a rioter. If you've been following that story, you know what I'm talking about. Now, over the past 5 years, this group, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, has been hosting training sessions and rallies, and they make speeches, and they organize meetings, and they've done this in at least 30 states, and they do it for law enforcement officers, for right-wing political figures, for private Christian fascist organizations, and members of the public if you can meet their criteria. I would imagine you have to be white and Christian and lean toward the fascist form of government. This is all according to the Howard Center's 7-month investigation of this group of neo-Nazis. And the investigation was conducted in collaboration with the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting, like I mentioned. Now, the group, the sheriffs, the peace officer, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, they've held formal training in at least 13 of those 30 states where they've had their little seminars. And in 6 states, the training was approved for these officers' continuing education credits. You know, every state has certain criteria for law enforcement officers about how they can advance in grade or pay or what have you. And in 6 states, the training by this fascist group has gotten approval by whatever state legislative committees are necessary to make the approval. How about that? Now, the group also has supporters who sit on 3 state boards in charge of law enforcement training standards. So just like the way the Christian fascists weaseled their way into government to the point now that we are in just the worst crisis this country has ever been in. And again, let me say, it's not because of Jews, it's not because of Muslims, it's not because of Hindus, it's not because of Buddhists. It is strictly because of Christians who identify, maybe not self-identify, but they are identified as Christian fascists. Who identifies them that way? Well, I do, for one. Now, back to the training that this group of fascists have conducted in 13 states. Legal experts warn that this training, especially when it's approved for state credit for advancement, that the training can undermine the democratic process that you find in the U.S. Constitution. That's why the name Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association just once again makes me want to scream, just like seeing these bastards use the name Christian, not this group, but any of these right-wing Nazis claim to be Christian. I just, okay, deep breath, sorry. Where was I? Legal experts warn that the training from this group of crypto Nazis undermine the democratic process and just about everything that's in the U.S. Constitution, and is part of what a former federal prosecutor named Mary McCord, she's also the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy at Georgetown University, she calls this, quote, a broader insurrectionist ideology, end quote. And she says this ideology, and you know this, I know this, has gripped the nation since the 2020 presidential election, thanks to Donald Trump and his inner circle of mafia types, fascist types. Now, what Mary McCord has said is this about this group. They have no authority, this is a quote, they have no authority, not under their state constitutions, or implementing statutes within their state legal system to decide what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. That's what courts have the authority to do, not sheriffs, end quote, Mary McCord. But you see, this whole fascist movement, there's nothing about fascism that is about the courts or about the rule of law or about constitutional authority or about the delegation of power, of authority. None of that applies when you get into the area of fascism. It's all top down. The boss of all bosses makes the decision. Law enforcement is conducted by paramilitaries, and the decisions of law enforcement are final. There's no recourse. Ms. McCord adds this, quote, there's another sort of evil lurking here. Because the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association is now essentially part of a broader movement in the United States to think it's okay to use political violence if we disagree with some sort of government policy. Political violence. This is what the orange bastard has been pushing these unbalanced MAGA hat-wearing assholes toward ever since he first appeared on stage with his rallies about beat him up, run him out, smack the shit out of him. Violence as a government policy. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.